paper. All right, so first of all, what makes a paper scientific? And the biggest clue in that you can get to try to figure out is this paper scientific is was it peer reviewed? All right, so if it's been peer reviewed, right, it's been forwarded to other experts in the field, right? Those experts have looked at the paper, looked at the quality of the research, looked at the results of the research, the accuracy of the research, given kind of their 2 cents on the paper, right? And so it's not just you saying these things happen, but it's experts also validating that, yeah, you did it the right way, everything looks valid, I don't see any bias, you're not making up information, this paper looks good to go. All right? Now, once it's been peer reviewed, it will get sent back to the author, all right, with a few different options. All right, so one is that the paper is immediately accepted into the journal that they want to publish in, all right, which is awesome, that's great, that hardly ever happens. All right, the second option is that it needs revisions based on comments made. Right, this is typically what authors will get back. Those reviewers will have looked at the paper, made comments, and maybe they made a comment like, this section needs to be a little bit more detailed, I don't quite understand what happened there. It might be something like do another little experiment just to verify that this worked correctly, right? That's typically what's going to happen. Another way that it can get sent back to the author is that it's flat out rejected, right? They're rejecting the research, not saying that the research isn't valid, but that the research needs more to it, all right? It needs a major overhaul in how it was done, how it was presented, something. All right, now once that's done, the author can always try to resubmit it. All right, but once the author has had that paper peer reviewed, they've made revisions as necessary, the journal has accepted it, all right, that is out for publication. All right, so big picture is that other people have looked at this paper. All right, another way to kind of determine is this paper scientific is that it presents original data or original research. All right, so the authors were the ones that actually did the experiment, they actually did the research, they personally conducted it. Right, they're not trying to write on some experiment that happened 10 years ago by some other author. All right, now a caveat to that is that sometimes you will find review articles, right, in which an author will take other research and review them together, compare them against each other. Now, it's still a scientific paper, right, because these papers have never been compared against each other. It still goes through the peer review process, right, but in this instance, it does not present original research. Right, so that's a little caveat there. All right, when we're looking at a scientific paper, we typically have 5 parts. Now, this can vary based on where you're looking at, where you found your paper at, right, but typically has 5 parts. Right? The first is an abstract, and that's basically a summary of what you're about to read. Right? It summarizes everything in the paper in a nice condensed paragraph. Right? The next section would be the introduction. Right? So the introduction is going to give background information, kind of orient you to what you're looking at, what the researchers are researching, why it's important that it needs to be researched. All right? And specifically their objectives or their hypotheses will be in the introduction. Now, if you notice that image I put up here, right, the introduction is kind of like this upside down triangle, right, because the introduction typically starts out very, very broad. Right? So, for example, if I were to produce a paper on the impacts of climate change on drought-adapted species, right, I would first start by talking about climate change. Then I might start talking about drought species of plants, then maybe my very specific plant, and then get down to my very, very specific hypotheses and objectives. We're going from broad to very specific. Now the next section would be the methods. All right, so this just very clearly states how the researchers set up their experiment. Depending on the experiment, the methods section can be very long, it can be very short. All right, after the methods is the results. All right, so in this section, they are telling you what they found, but not speculating about why they found it. All right, they're simply stating the data. They're telling you, I found this, this, and this. This is the data associated with it. All right, it's not until the conclusion often called the discussion, all right, that they start to explain why they think they might have gotten those results. All right, they start to explain that data. So in the conclusion and discussion, it's kind of the opposite of the introduction, where we're starting very specific, very top of the triangle here, with our specific conclusions, why we think specifically our experiment reacted the way it did, right? And then trying to relate it back broadly to other research and maybe think about what might happen in the future, right? Now it's always going to be followed by some literature cited, right? So a big reference section. There's going to be a lot of references in most scientific papers. All right, a scientific paper needs to be published by a trusted source. All right, so the source is going to be something that had gone through that peer-reviewed process. So that might be a scientific database, scientific journals, which there are many, many out there. You might have heard of Nature. All right, that's the most popular, I think, scientific journal. There's many, many journals out there. All right, it might be through the university itself. All right. So, all right, just had to make sure this wasn't the spot where I showed you how to do it. How do I know my paper is scientific? I kind of put this image up here. I think this really summarizes everything. All right, it's published in a scholarly journal, typically right at the top of the paper. Right, it's very serious, it's thoughtful. This image says it needs to be more than 10 pages in length. All right. It definitely does not. All right, there can be some very short scientific papers out there. I don't agree with that image on that particular aspect, but some scientific papers can be fairly long. All right, it's going to be organized by those headings: abstract, introduction, methods, results, conclusion, sometimes called discussion. There's going to be a lot of citations. All right, citations throughout. They're typically in parentheses within the paper. All right. And the authors are going to be credited, meaning that they're usually going to be affiliated with some scientific institute, maybe it's a university, sometimes a governmental agency, right? They're going to have some credits behind them, right? It's not just an amateur going out in the field and doing whatever experiment they thought of. All right, so now we know how to identify a scientific paper. Let's look at how to find a scientific paper. So, 3 ways that I tend to find a scientific paper is using a library database, and we will go through how to find that on Gustavus's library database. Right, Google Scholar, right? I'm often lazy and I use Google Scholar because it's super convenient and I don't have to go through a bunch of websites to find a database, right? Or the author's personal website, right? So sometimes they'll have a research website where they post links to all the articles that they have personally done. All right, so we typically use keywords or phrases unless we know the specific title of what we're looking for or the specific author. And note that not all articles will be accessible. All right, some of them are hidden behind a paywall, which really, really sucks in academics. It's something that most people will agree with shouldn't exist, but it does. All right, so sometimes they're hidden behind a paywall. This is where it's useful to go through your library database because the library has subscriptions to a lot of these journals so you can get behind the paywall. So for this class, I put a link here to this website, astrobotany.com. They have a whole literature section that might be useful in your final project. All right, but let's start by looking at the library database. All right, so I simply typed in the search bar library, brought me to the library page here. All right, if I go databases, all right, there's a bunch of databases depending on what you're looking at. So in this class, we're not really interested in history, not necessarily health or exercise science, but maybe biology. All right, so if I click on biology, it should take me to that database, right, and I can search a keyword. So let's search, let's go back to our drought-stressed plants. Drought stress plants. All right, and that's going to give me a bunch of different articles right off the bat here. All right, depending on what specifically we're looking for, not all these might be something we're interested in, but maybe one of them might catch your eye. Maybe some of them can help identify better keywords to use in the future. All right, so there's a lot of databases through the library that you can try to look up. whatever article you're trying to find. Now, like I said, I'm usually pretty lazy, and unless I'm trying to get behind a paywall, I typically use Google Scholar. All right, Google Scholar works the same way. If I type in drought stress in plants, all right, there's a bunch of different articles here. Some of them are accessible, some of them are not. All right, so typically if there's a PDF symbol, you can get them. If there's not, in the case of this journal here, this one I bet is only going to tell you the abstract and be hidden behind need to pay to see more. Yeah, so you can only get the abstract for this one. Now, if this was something that I really, really wanted this paper, right, this is where I could go to my library, see if my library has access to this journal. If I can't find it and I still really, really want it, ask your librarians for help. All right, librarians are really, really good at tracking down different articles that you might need. Yes?
I don't know if this is something we were going to mention, but I've done this before for like psychology stuff.
Yeah.
And there is a form that I can like pass around. There's a form that you can go in and like input the information, and they'll find it for you and send it directly to you.
Oh, I did not know that. So yes, if you're really looking for an article, there is a form that if you want to email me that, I'll link that up on Moodle. That way, if you need to use that form, it is there and easy for you to access. Awesome. All right, librarians, they're amazing. All right, they can dig up incredible things. All right, let's see. I did the author's personal website on here. I don't have an example of that, but if you knew an author specialized in a field, you could see what they researched and maybe get a good paper that you needed to find. For this class, all right, astrobotany.com, all right, they have this whole list of literature that's really focused on astrobotany. Not all of it's scientific, right? Some of them might link to NASA sites, some of them might link to blogs. A lot of it is scientific though, right? So this is where you'd have to go through and vet, is it a scientific article or not? All right. So once you've found a scientific article, you actually have to read it, right? And scientific articles can be super dense, they can be confusing, they use a lot of jargon, all right? So I put up here kind of how to read the paper, all right? A lot of places might suggest something slightly similar to this, all right? But I think this is a good way to start, all right? The first thing you want to do is read the abstract. That paragraph at the beginning, it's going to give you an idea, is this a paper worth reading in its entirety, or is this not really what I'm looking for? Once you read the abstract, just skim the article, all right? Don't read it word for word. Maybe you'll read the first couple sentences of every paragraph to kind of get an idea of how it flows, what's happening in the paper, all right? Then you're going to go back, reread the article, all right? This is where you can read it word for word and identify any vocab you might not understand. Like I said, it's a lot of scientific jargon. You might have to look up some vocabulary. And then you can ask yourself specific questions on how well do I understand this article, all right? One of the things I often like to point out is this question here. Am I spending too much time on the less important parts of the article? All right, so if you're really struggling on one aspect, all right, move on to the next aspect. And maybe it'll kind of make more sense once you've read other things or maybe looked up other vocab terms. All right, don't get stuck on like one paragraph or one section. All right, I put a lot of links in this PowerPoint as well that are other helpful guides of how to read a scientific paper. All right, but let's read a paper together. All right, so I have linked this paper in the PowerPoint. I have also put it up on Moodle. All right, I have also cited the paper here, which in your homework I am asking you to cite it, and I have given you kind of an example layout of how I would like you to cite it. Pay particular attention to where there are periods, where there are commas, where there's parentheses, right? But let's look at this article. All right, I'll give you a couple minutes to pull it up. Scientific articles are one of the things for me that I almost have to read it on physical paper. All right, so I did print out this article because I wanted to read it, and I just can't read it on a computer. You might be different than me, but I had to print it out. All right, has everybody navigated to this paper? All right, sounds good. All right, so the first thing we want to look at is what journal is this article published in? All right, so let's look at it. And can anybody tell me what journal it's published in? Yeah?
Plant cell biotechnology and molecular biology.
Yeah, exactly. And we found that right at the very top here. All right, plant cell biotechnology and molecular biology. Now, sometimes things are condensed down into a type of acronym or just the first letters of the journal. You might have to look up, well, what does it actually stand for? All right, but in this case, they spelt it all out for us. It's really nice and clear. Now, there's a lot of numbers behind it. All right, some of the more important ones you might be looking at is this 21. All right, I believe that means issue 21. All right, it might be volume 21. I'm all of a sudden blanking on that. All right, but I'm not requiring you to actually write this down in your citation. It's going to give the page numbers that it's actually has the page numbers for the journal it's published in print with. Now, a lot of times these days, journals are going online, so you might not see the page numbers anymore. And lastly, it's giving us the year. All right, so what year was this one published in? 2020, yeah, so it's fairly recent, all right, which I would expect because it's an astrobotany article, and that's fairly recent, all right. It's going to give the title, nice and bold, easy to look at. The authors will be right behind it, and then it's going to give it the author's affiliations, all right. What agency are they working for? All right. So let's read the paper together and take more or less 5 minutes here, read the abstract, and then be able to tell me what is this paper about. Alright, does anybody need more time on the abstract? Alright, so what is this paper about? Who wants to give a brief synopsis? Alright, there's a lot of class participation in this lecture, so I might have to start calling on people. I hate doing that though. Yeah.
I'll try my best. So it was talking about how microgravity and like being able to experiment using it has evolved and gotten a lot easier, and so and a lot of the plants that we eat have also kind of become a little bit more adaptive. So they tested 10 plants that would kind of be pretty essential to life really anywhere, to see how they would respond to microgravity. After that, I'm not 100% sure.
Yes. That's essentially it, yeah. So they looked at these 10 plants to see how they responded to simulated microgravity. The rest of the abstract is giving you kind of their preliminary results, or broad results, I should say, and kind of a brief conclusion. All right. So that's going to give you a good idea. Is this paper worth reading? All right, which I decided for us, yes, it is worth reading. All right, so next I want you to just kind of skim the article. All right, and notice what catches your attention right away. I just looked through, maybe I'll read like the first sentence of a couple paragraphs. I looked at any images that are presented. Maybe I'll read the last paragraph and the conclusions. All right, just skimming the article. Shouldn't take too long. What do we notice right away? What catches your attention? Yeah?
They're simulating microgravity on Earth.
Yeah, they're simulating microgravity on Earth. We're not up in space for this, yeah.
And it really works.
It works, yeah. Inslee, did you have a...
Yeah, I was gonna say that the references, there's a small amount of references that you can kind of see in another paper that has a bit more substantial background research, since this is so new, there are a lot of references, which is actually
Yeah, we might know as maybe compared to other papers, this one only has, what, 11 references? That's pretty short for a scientific paper.
there's a lot of figures and tables, and there's actually a section of pictures of the seeds.
Yeah, we have visual representation of our data. Nice.
It was largely focused on the growth of the roots.
Yeah, we focused on the roots for that. Yeah, very nice. So just by skimming the article, we can pull out some key points. All right. So the next part, I want you to read the introduction. This might take a little bit here, right? And I want you to try to figure out what are the author's hypothesis. And I'm going to make a caveat to this here in saying that this paper doesn't have a really poignant hypothesis, but they do have an objectives. So try to find the objectives instead of the hypothesis. the introduction coming along? Does anybody need more time? All right. So the introduction, I think, is probably one of the more easier parts of the paper to understand. All right. But let's answer, what are the author's hypotheses or objectives in this case?
It says in the last part that the objectives of this research was to determine the impact of gravity on the sample plants. Ascertain their orientation and simulated microgravity identified within them. So basically they took a bunch of they took, I think like they said like limbs and then like fruits and then to see, since like root growth is essential to their development, to see just how it impacted it. So they list all those objectives.
Yeah, exactly. So the objectives are to look at the impact of simulated microgravity on these 10 plants, all right? And we can see those objectives listed very clearly in the last paragraph of the introduction. And it's pretty typical that you will find the objectives or the hypotheses on the last paragraph of the introduction. All right, now, part of the introduction, all right, they kind of give background on what a clinostat was. So let's just take a look at one because I think they're interesting. I would have loved to have gotten one for this class.
With endless views of snow-covered peaks.
Right, but as they mentioned, they're limited and they're expensive. I don't know if this one's going to show us it actually moving. There we go. Alright, so it's basically moving in all angles to try to get rid of any one direction of gravity. Alright, now this is a 3D. They used a 2D to take out one of those turning mechanisms, and that would be the 2D. Now, let's see, this one says 2D. So this is a less exciting one. Alright, but looks like we're just rotating on one axis here to try to get rid of some gravity. And they have plants oriented different ways. Alright. I thought they were interesting. I looked at multiple ways of how we could try to do some sort of like DIY clinostat in this class. It's really hard. There's just no good way to do that. So that's why our gravity experiment, just like they did in this experiment, which we'll see, we just rotated it 90 degrees, just to look at the impacts. All right. So next I want you to read the methods to figure out how exactly they did this. What did they look at? And they've alluded to this many times, and you might not understand everything in the methods, just kind of get an idea of what's going on. Would anybody like more time on the methods? All right. So what did they do to answer their question? What specifically was done? I guess, what broadly was done?
They planted the same seeds in like 3 different conditions basically. So one was just normal gravity, and then the other one was rotated, kind of like what we did in our experiment, and then the other was on the clinostat or
The clinostat? Yeah. That's exactly what they did. Very broadly, they planted seeds, put them into 3 different treatments, and then let those treatments run, and they took a lot of observations. Now notice in the methods, they are very, very specific, right? Because they want to make sure that if anybody replicates this experiment, they can replicate it, right? Down to like the model of the camera that they use to take the images, right? It is very specific in a scientific paper, whereas often the experiment is pretty easy to understand, all right? Let's see, why did they do the one that was rotated 90 degrees? Anyone pick up on that?
I basically wanted to make sure that like gravity was doing
Yeah, they wanted to essentially double check gravity, all right? Make sure that these plants, they do indeed respond to gravity, right? So by turning them 90 degrees and saw how the root curvature turned, right, they verified that. All right. Now I'd like you to read the results. There's a lot of data in the results, all right? So just kind of broadly read through it, right? Don't have to try to analyze it yourself here, all right? But think about what did they find, right? And think about the visuals they used and how effective those visuals were. All right, who needs more time on the methods? A few more minutes? All right, so what did they find? What were their results? Very broadly, what did they find? Yeah.
That growth rate was affected sometimes by the microgravity.
Yeah, they found that growth rate was affected by some plants. And this is where I make a lot of notes in mine so I can remember where things were. But I think they had, yeah, the average growth rate of the roots of all plants except for cotton and sorghum increased under simulated microgravity, right, which is kind of interesting. Right, what else did they find? Right, very simply, was there effective gravity and microgravity? Yeah, yeah. Anyone have anything else to add? All right. So yeah, they basically found that yeah, microgravity has an effect on these plants. All right. They looked at a bunch of different measurements, curvature of the roots, the root length, root growth rate, whole bunch of measurements here to kind of confirm that and give us some data behind it. Right. What types of visuals did they use? Graphs. Yeah, they had a lot of graphs in this one. They also used something else.
Excel.
What was that?
They mentioned that they use Excel.
Yeah, they used Excel to analyze all their data. And yeah, visually they also used a picture, which is actually kind of rare in a lot of journals because it doesn't make sense, but well, I guess it does make sense. But to print something in color costs the author a lot more money than to print in black and white. Which, again, it's that whole idea of authors having to pay to show the public their research. But they have some very nice images here, all right? And you can kind of see in a lot of them here. Let's zoom in on cotton here, right? This is their 90-degree sample, and there is effective gravity, totally. All right. Now, one of the things about this paper, all right, is they kind of clumped the results of discussion together. So you'll notice towards the end of the discussion, they start giving some ideas as to why they might have seen some of their results. All right. So specifically, let me zoom in. Page 102 here, where I noticed that they started to make some assumptions. All right. We'll have a physiological basis, which may possibly be a result of the following. Right? They're starting to interpret their data here, which would be typical in a discussion part of the paper, but they've kind of lumped them together as both. One thing I did want to point out, and let me go back to page 100. All right. They're also looking at the effects of spaceflight on plants in this research called APEX down on the Veggie system on ISS. All right, now we're actually going to have a guest speaker on not next Monday, but the Monday after, who is working with APEX doing this kind of research. Right? Now I don't think it's specifically gravitropism related. I think it's a little bit more genetics. He'll give us a nice background on it. Right? But I thought that was a cool tie-in to what we're reading now, and we'll actually be talking to someone looking at this. All right, so the last part of this paper is just the conclusion, right? Sometimes called the discussion, sometimes they're separated out. Totally depends on the journal, right? Just a couple of paragraphs, so take 2-3 minutes here to read the last part of the experiment. All right, so why are these results significant? What do the authors say is important about this research? Yeah.
It can be useful both in space travel and here on Earth for the growth of crops.
Yeah, they can use the data that they obtain not only in space but for here on Earth. That's definitely significant. All right. Yeah.
They also say that it could increase the plant agricultural productivity when the seeds that are in the clinostat when transferred to the field.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the next question I have. What do the authors suggest doing next? They suggest just that, right? Taking those seeds and seeing if we saw increased growth when they're in the clinostat. Are they going to continue having increased growth and production when they're transplanted into soil, right? So that's a good future direction, and this is often where they would mention a future direction of the paper. All right, I know scientific papers are dense. All right, I can only read about 1 or 2 a day before I start to zone out. It takes a lot of brain power, right? So for your assignment today, I have these additional resources in case you need some guidance on how to read it here. But for your assignment, all right, I really just want you to find a paper on astrobotany and answer some questions that I have put up here, very similar to what we answered in class. Right, so hopefully you should have a kind of a guideline of where to find these. I don't expect you to have the most thorough knowledge of the paper when you're done, but be able to broadly understand what happened and what the results were. All right, so this is worth 10 points, 5 points. It is due tomorrow, along with the quizzes the readings. Actually, I think they're all videos for the quiz tomorrow. One thing I wanted just to kind of point out is I did hear there was a prediction of possibly freezing rain overnight. I will email you if anything inhibits my travel to get here on campus. All right, Friday is looking even worse with snow. It is possible we might have a virtual day on Friday. I will keep you updated. All right, as soon as I find out, I will let you know. All right, any questions? All right, that is all for today. Go enjoy the rest of this nice, sunny, warm day.